You can do too much of everything. You can do too much sauna. You can do too much cold. You can do too much sleep, too much food, too much training, too much breathing. You can do too much of everything, too much hydration. And cold water is not inert. It's a huge force. And it's prudent to approach it with a minimum time goal so that you can get the maximum out of your life in other areas.
It isn't about being perfect. It's about being better. Hello, my name is Dr. Stephanie Stima, and I host expert discussions with thought leaders in all facets of health, including nutrition, fitness, hormones, stress management, performance, recovery, longevity, health span, and energy production. On this show, we discuss complex science, but then we also alchemize it into actionable, everyday living. The ultimate goal with the show is to assist you in making informed decisions about your health and to catapult you into being the hero in your own life. Hello, my Betties. Welcome back to another episode of Better with Dr. Stephanie. It's me, your host, Dr. Stephanie Stima. Today, I am bringing you a conversation on cold water immersion. Don't flip the channel yet. I definitely want you to stick around for this. This is probably one of the most insightful conversations I've had around cold water immersion. My guest today is Marie Bodine, and a little bit about Marie. She is a cold performance and mindset coach who facilitates a variety of powerful practices from cold water immersion to deep mindset training. Her mantra is having a regulated mind is a modern superpower, and she trains high-level performers, pro athletes, elite military teams to help them recalibrate their minds, repair their bodies, improve immunity, and connect to an unshakable inner peace. She's level 2 certified Wim Hof method instructor, a Spartan athlete, and a passionate advocate for mental wellness. And I'll just say that I went into this conversation thinking that we were going to talk about all the mechanistic data around cold water immersion, and we certainly touch on that. But what was very surprising was her approach to cold water immersion, why we want to be incorporating this in addition to other adjuncts like stress reduction and sauna therapy and exercise. I think that you're going to find her conversation incredibly enlightening. If you are part of my Even Better Betty membership, the premium membership that we have here for the podcast, you are going to actually find my real thoughts on the conversation at the end of this episode. So stay tuned for that. And if you want to hear my thoughts on each and every episode on the show, please consider joining our Even Better premium membership. You can find that at estima.supercast.com. All right, so please enjoy my conversation on cold water immersion with Marie Bodine. Marie Bodine, welcome to The Better Show. I'm delighted to welcome you today.
Super excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
We are talking all about cold water immersion. So we are going to be talking about cold plunges. We can talk about some of the differences in terms of what are different ways to expose ourselves to the cold. I think that this is a really great place to start. So a lot of women that I speak to, when I give them the option, like, hey, which one do you like better? Like cold water immersion or sauna? They're like, oh, sauna. Like 100%. I prefer to be warm than cold. So what are some of the reasons why we might think about cold water immersion as a recovery tool or something that we might incorporate for whatever reason into our daily or weekly practice?
This question comes up a lot with not just the groups of people that I see and I train during workshops, but almost everyday conversation. Like when we're getting together on a Friday night and people find out sort of what I do most of the time during my week, they have questions like, why? Why should I get into cold water? The overview, and I will say this in general, because I think you want to talk a little bit also, and I do too, about hormesis and how important that is. But I think when we look at the past couple of 100 years and how we've been living, indoor plumbing is relatively new, indoor heating is relatively new. And if we look a little bit behind that, a little bit beyond that in throughout history, we'll see that our bodies are actually designed to receive various temperatures of hot and cold. What do I mean by that? Well, we have actually cold receptors on our skin and hardwired into our system. We also have heat receptors hardwired there as well. And because they exist, our body prefers that we use them. We have muscles that take us from here to there. We are meant to have strong muscles. Everything in our system is meant to be there for a purpose. So because we can feel cold and hot, we are meant to be exposed to intelligent variations of that temperature so that our body understands that we can keep using those systems to be whole and healthy.
I love that. And I was recently at I guess would be called like a Scandinavian style spa, like a thermal spa where you're alternating with heat and cold. And I can't tell you how blissed out I was. You get into the cold, I was trying to stay there for like 2 to 5 minutes, let's say. And then I was in a sauna session for longer than that. It was like maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And then just repeat. And I know that I was staying in there maybe longer than some of the time recommendations, and we'll talk about that today as well. But I was so relaxed.
Mm-hmm.
I felt almost high. Like it felt like I was on mushrooms. I was so relaxed at the end of the day, so blissed out. And to your point around the different skin receptors for heat and cold, let's just for back of the envelope, someone who is new to the show maybe has never heard of the term hormesis or a eustress before. Why is cold water, maybe coupling it with heat, with sauna, something like that? Why is that a good type of stress? What adaptations can we expect or can we see in the body from that?
Right. So when someone who's never done cold exposure comes up to me and says, I've never done that, but I keep hearing about it and it doesn't sound easy and it doesn't sound fun and it sounds like a really not the best time on a Friday night. Like, what's the most important thing that I need to know? And usually I try to draw comparisons to people that they're familiar with. So I look at cold exposure and heat exposure very, very similarly to exercise, and I make a lot of comparisons about the gym. So if someone today is watching this episode and listening and saying, what is so important, special, valuable about the cold? I will say a couple of things. Well, we have cardiac tissue. Your heart has muscle fibers in it because it contracts. It's called cardiac tissue because it has cardiac muscle fibers. When we go to the gym and lift weights, we know that we have skeletal muscle tissue. So those muscles have contractile tissue that help move our bones so that we can locomote and go places. Interestingly enough, all the veins and capillaries and the arteries in our body have something called smooth muscle tissue, which contract. And we want to keep those muscle fibers strong and elastic as well. So cold water is like weights for your veins. That's how I explain it to people. And when people say, oh, well, that makes sense because I know lifting weights helps me get stronger and going running or walking, that helps my cardiac tissue. That makes sense that cold is a vasoconstrictor, and that's going to help activate those muscle fibers to become more conditioned and to be more resilient and elastic. That's generally what I say. And then people say, okay, I get that.
That's a great explanation. And I think anyone who's ever worn like compression, socks or compression stockings, this is sort of like the same thing. What we're trying to do with that vasoconstriction is we're trying to return that blood to the heart or get more efficient at it. Because when you think about the arteries, there's a pump, right? The heart is a pump. Then there's a certain pressure that is delineated in the arteries. But once that blood is deoxygenated, the way that the blood kind of gets back is through, the best way to say it is just like sphincters, right? Like we see like the vein sort of traveling up the leg, back up to the heart. It's through contraction and opening and closing of these sphincters. So which is done via smooth muscle. So I think that is a very good explanation for why this is another way to work out, right? But it's working out the smooth muscle tissue, which is under control of the autonomic system. We can't voluntarily, in the same way that with a skeletal muscle, I can say, okay, I'm going to lift and I'm going to contract my bicep. Like that is under voluntary control. That's what skeletal muscle is. Cardiac tissue, pretty much not voluntary. I can't make my heart beat, although there is some technique, like breathing techniques where I can slow down and speed up my heart rate for sure. But smooth muscle tissue is largely involuntary. Like I cannot cause contraction of my smooth muscle tissue as much as I would like to, as much as I would like to be able to do that. That is really under autonomic unconscious control.
I'll take it one step further. People say, okay, so cold water is a vasoconstrictor, so why should I care? Well, as you know, 19 million people globally don't make it to their next year because of these cardiovascular issues. And so when we have stronger muscle fibers, especially after menopause, and you may have been discussing that with other people, we want to have those veins and arteries become more adaptive and more intuitive with reading the environment. Cold and hot does that. So when we notice it or when we feel it, and we have our veins and capillaries through the nervous system create that change, when our system is more responsive that way, I find that would be a little bit more healthy. When we look at heart rate variability, we want that kind of sensitivity and that strength and that strong adaptive way. And I think that when we can do some very simple things with cold and hot, it doesn't have to be this huge program. It can be something very simple. And I will share some stories about that too with some of the people that have come to some of my workshops, that it really doesn't have to be this big thing. There's a lot of people too that think, oh, I'm never going to get into an ice bath, so forget it. And what I love doing is changing those people's minds to create something that works for them. Forget about what they read on all the other, studies and podcasts. Like, let's create something that works for you so that you can feel included in this process. Because I know that you see a lot of things online where people do these crazy long ice baths, and that's one way to do it, but that's not the only way.
I really love what you're saying, because I think that for most women, and we'll talk about menopause in just a moment, but for most women, menopause or not, postmenopause or premenopause, we feel like it has to be difficult, like it has to hurt in order for it to be effective or worthy of our time. Like there has to be some suffering or some pain associated with it. So I really appreciate that gentle gradient view of things. It's like, why don't we just, if you don't have good cold tolerance right now, let's just give you something a little bit gentle. So it's cool. It might be cool, right? And of course, this is very subjective, right? And we can get into some of the nociceptors and like the differences in our skin temperature versus the skin of the temperature of the ice or the temperature of the cold bath. I mean, that also is going to make, I know, for example, my husband and I can draw a bath and he can put his hand in the bath and he'll be like, this is burning. Like I'm going to get a 3rd degree burn if I get in here. And I'm like, this is just great. This is just nice warm water for me. It's literally the same stimulus, right? But our nociceptor, like our temperature receptors on the surface of our skin, as you were saying, the hot and cold receptors on the surface of our skin are interpreting the stimulus differently. And so if somebody is is reticent to try cold water therapy because they just think it's going to be painful or it's going to be awful or you're going to be shivering uncontrollably, and we'll talk about the shiver response today as well, why don't we just make it like an easy yes? Why don't we make it something gentle to start with, like meet you where you're at? And then in the same way that I would never say, oh, you want to run? Okay, so tomorrow there's a marathon happening. So why don't you just like do that? Like no coach, would ever tell you that. Or like, oh, you're new to weight training. Okay, so I'm just going to put 6 plates on the barbell and we'll just see what happens. Like no one would ever do that. Mm-hmm. Right? You'd start off with a machine. You'd start off with instruction on technique and form and breathing. And I think that the same is true here with cold water. The other thing I wanted to maybe bring up, and we were talking about this in the pre-chat, and I was like, oh, this is really juicy. Let's make sure we talk about this, and I'll come back to menopause in just a moment, because I think that there's some thermoregulation issues that we typically see, like the hot flashes and the lack of thermal control in menopause. But I just want to address this piece first, and then we can kind of get into the mechanics of it. The stress response. So women, I get this question all the time. Why do you work so hard? Aren't you worried about cortisol? And I get the same question with cold water immersion. Like, aren't you worried about cortisol? Aren't you worried about being really stressed out? So let's talk a little bit about, and maybe just for definition, let's talk about good stress versus bad stress. Like not all stress is bad. I think that it gets a bit of a misnomer in the online space. I think there's good stress that we should be continuously exposing ourselves to adapt and grow and thrive. So let's talk a little bit about that cortisol or that sympathetic response that happens in cold water immersion, and why potentially this is something that we want to be seeking and not avoiding.
I'm going to tell you about 2 extremes too with good stress as well that can take you way out of the range of what you would even want. So
okay,
we want to know that anytime that we are faced with a challenge, whether we voluntarily go to it or whether it has been introduced to us and we are being asked to face something, there's a mental process that's involved. The body, as you may know, is hardwired for relaxation. We want things to be easy. We really like to be comfortable. So the fact that we're actually taking ourselves to these places means that we've made a decision, that we understand that making that effort is going to pay off huge in the long term, even though in the short term it might not feel as fun as maybe, like you mentioned already, a sauna or taking a nap or having some comforting food. We do realize, though, too, like just like going to the gym, that when you challenge yourself in a very short amount of time with something that is within your realm of, I can do this, but it's challenging, your life just gets bigger. Your response to controlled stress or controlled surprises or controlled challenges, when we practice these things, you're going to have an incredibly different response when you experience something in your life that you can't control. When someone that you know has a medical event, how are you going to respond? Are you going to be comforting? Are you going to be trying to shut yourself down? Like, how are you going to manage? And so when we see the world outside and we know that there's a lot of things that happen that are really great and really not so great, how are we responding to these things? When we can self-regulate our immune system or our nervous system or how we perceive a moment, we have so much more power and so much more autonomy. And that's why I think doing these things is going to help us long term. Like some people say, well, seek discomfort, because if you don't, discomfort will seek you. It just depends on how hard you want your life to be. So we go and do these things in a controlled way so that we can manage how hard it is. When we have things that we can't control, like I just mentioned, then we have more of an opportunity of being able to mentally manage it, because life can be very challenging and I want to be ready. I've had many, many challenging things happen, and cold water and breathing has helped me more than any of the other techniques that I have tried. I didn't have the resources and the skills to be able to manage it mentally as much as I do now. I'm so grateful that this practice has changed my life.
Yeah, there's a saying, something like making consistently easy choices leads to a hard life, that instant gratification, and consistently choosing hard, making hard decisions leads to an easy life. So there's a bit of a conundrum there because, as you mentioned, neurologically wired to be comfortable, sit on the couch, take a nap. And of course, those things are important and they have their place. And there should also be a voluntary, I think this should be a voluntary subjecting yourself to things that are uncomfortable. Like, I talk about this a lot on the show, like going to the gym, like you are voluntarily working your muscles to failure. That doesn't feel good. Sometimes, most times it doesn't feel good. You're not necessarily motivated to do that, but you enact discipline and you say, okay, the more that I do this, the more I'm going to drive and fortify this sort of mental grit, this grit at the cellular level. And I think that cold water immersion parallels that as well. And I mentioned menopause, and I want to come back to that now if we can, because I think that this sort of perimenopausal transition, along with menopause as well, like midlife can be very challenging. There's physiological changes that are happening. We're seeing a decline in sex hormones. There's insulin resistance. There's often body composition changes. Sleep is affected. You run the whole gamut. But particularly with midlife, I do find that there is, if you don't find a way to manage your stress, you said something just now which I liked. It's like, if you don't seek discomfort, discomfort will seek you. And I think that that's true in menopause as well. I think that we must become masters of mitigating and managing our stress, because we just have to assume that stuff is going to happen, the good, the bad, the very ugly, the very tragic, and the very sad. And we have to be able to figure out who we want to be and how we want to show up when those things happen. So let's talk a little bit about menopause, and certainly understanding, you're not a medical doctor. You're not doling out medical advice. There's no doctor-patient relationship here. But one of the things that we do see in menopause is this thermal dysregulation, right? So the common thing that women will say is, I'm running hot all of a sudden, like literally no reason. I'm having a hot flash, or I'm usually overnight. They'll say that they're running hot overnight. Is there any evidence, or are you aware, either with individuals that you've worked with or any literature that you may have perused, on women in that perimenopausal and menopausal transition and using cold water therapy to help mitigate some of these changes in our ability to regulate our temperature?
Absolutely. And so there's a couple of things I'll talk about. I'll talk about some of the things that I've read and that I've seen with other people, and then I'll talk about my own personal experience as well.
Great.
I know that you live in Canada. I live in Canada too. We have 4 seasons. We're already doing cold exposure because we live in a country that has very extreme, temperatures.
Yep.
So when I look at some research and when I read some of the things that I've been reading, the gist of what I'm gathering is that because we are able to be a little bit more adaptive to these extreme temperatures in a very short amount of time, that our system becomes a little bit more intelligent with how it's going to run on the inside. And so what does that mean? It means that people that practice, for example, exercise we've just talked about. Sauna, we might talk about later, but sauna is included in this because it's a temperature change. And cold exposure changes how our hormones behave in the system. So when our hormones behave differently, there's an opportunity there to become more regulated or more adaptive. So what I'm hearing is, especially on the Facebook groups, I jump on a lot of pages. There's a menopausal women and cold training page. There's all kinds of people that talk anecdotally about their experiences that when they were going through these types of changes, cold water really, really helped manage these symptoms of that temperature dysregulation. When I talk to people about my own personal experiences, it took me 3 or 4 winters to be able to go outside and actually not be bothered by these extreme temperatures. You've probably gone outside and you've been at a minus 20 Celsius with a wind coming at you outside trying to get from one place to the next. And I was the last person that, if you had told me 20 years ago that I would be doing this, I just would have totally just laughed in your face. There's no way you could have actually ever convinced me that I was going to be doing this. And one of the reasons why I started to do this is I was standing at a bus stop in February, and I guess there was a storm, and I didn't know that the bus wasn't going to come. I didn't know that the bus wasn't going to be able to get up the hill, and I wasn't going to be able to get home. And I was standing there wishing that I was any place else than right there. And I finally took a moment and I said to myself, do I really want to spend the rest of my life wishing I was not where I was? How many more moments do I want to forfeit and saying, I just wish I was here. I wish I was there. I wish this wasn't part of my life. I wish this was different. And I just thought, I really want to embrace and accept and have fun with exactly where I am. I know life is full of suffering, but I want to suffer a little bit more intelligently. So how can I do that? And when I started taking cold showers, when I started taking ice baths, yes, it was challenging, but I definitely want to share some of the very interesting methods that I use to get around that. And as I just mentioned, after 3 or 4 winters, I was laughing because I couldn't really believe how my body was like, I got you now. We figured it out. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to get into that fear state. We're going to adapt for you. And that's the best way that I can describe it. When you're in that situation and you feel nothing, and then you start laughing, your body has your back.
Yeah, and I think that one of the principles I would say for perimenopause and menopause is the way that you treat your body now is how your body is going to treat you in the future. So, for you, it was 3 or 4 winters of probably consistent cold training, and now you're in what some might call a brutal Canadian winter, with this bus not being able to make it up, and you're like, all right, I can figure this out. And I can tell you, I'll share a personal story as well. Last year, we did not use our winter coats. So I have been using the cold water immersion now for I guess it's been about a year. And last winter we didn't use I have my big Canada Goose thing, the big blanket jacket with all the hats and the mitts and all the things. I didn't use any of it. And recently I was at a tournament. I made the mistake, what some might have been a fatal mistake. I thought that the tournament was indoors. So I just didn't bring a jacket. I just wore my indoor clothes, and it was outdoors, and it was a Friday night, and it was freezing outside. And was I shivering? Yes. Was I doing lunges on the side of the pitch? Yes. But I still was able to manage 90 minutes or, plus halftime, whatever it was, let's call it 100 minutes outside in very cold weather. I don't know exactly what the temperature was, but it was at least close to 0 in centigrade, around 30 degrees Fahrenheit for my Americans. It was cold. It was very cold. And I was shivering, and I was like, well, okay, that was my cold water immersion. After he was finished the game or whatever, well, I don't need to do cold water immersion because I just did 100 minutes of it just now. but I felt like I was way more resilient making that error, not realize I thought it was indoor season, whatever, I made a mistake, whatever. And we ended up being outside, but I still had that cellular grit, that cellular resilience to like figure out what to do and to be able to kind of, I could have gone to the car and waited, I guess, but I chose to watch the game.
Do you know how many times I hear people tell me that at those particular moments, just like that their life totally changed forever for the better?
Yeah. There's like a psychological freedom. There's a psychological freedom with it. It's like, the cold, like, it's not going to get me. Like, I'll figure it out.
Yeah. And I think there's another thing I want to remind everyone too, because I love reminding myself, I'm healthy enough to get to do this. I'm healthy enough to be able to go outside or pull out, off my glove and use my phone in the dead of winter and not be thinking something negative about the situation, the circumstance, myself, another person. I think negativity, and I want to touch on that for sure when we get right into cold exposure. When we start attaching negativity to these practices, how much health are we actually really building? I don't think it's talked about enough that our mindset while we're doing pretty much everything is going to either raise up or fine tune your immune system or continue to suppress it, even if you're doing something that you think is healthy for you.
Yeah, it's like the have to versus the get to, right? It's like, oh, I have to do this thing, or I get to challenge myself. I get to become a better version of myself. I get to regulate my blood pressure and all the benefits that cold water immersion, which we'll talk about in a moment, can confer. Okay, well, let's maybe talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms of action in terms of your understanding of what. So we sort of talked a little bit about the mindset of this, like where the premise of cold water immersion, the sort of evolutionary expectation that there's going to be hormetic stressors in temperature extremes, both hot and cold. Let's talk a little bit about some of the benefits, and we've touched a little bit on it in terms of menopause, in terms of helping with thermal regulation and your resilience to the cold. Another question that I get a lot is, how long do I need to stay in the tub? Like, how long do I need to stay in a cold plunge, let's say? And is there any gender differences? So I think that there are, but I would love for you to speak to that.
Gender differences is such an interesting topic and conversation that I definitely want to get into with you, because I'm still doing some research on that. I know that there's behavioral differences. I absolutely see women and men approach a cold plunge differently. What I will say is the way I teach and facilitate immersions now is a lot different than what I did last year and absolutely 2 years before. I've been teaching for almost 7 years now, and I'm seeing that because I'm growing and because I'm interested in how it's affecting people physiologically, I'm changing my approach to make it more easy and more fun. Way more like, if we're not having fun, I don't really want to do it. And that goes back to, again, having these positive approaches to these things, because there's enough rules in life as adults. Like, I don't need more rules, and I don't think the people that want to learn how to do this need more rules too. There's guidelines and guardrails, so let's get into that for sure. When I hear people say spend 2 minutes in the water or 3 minutes in the water or 11 minutes a week or all these numbers, these are ideas that help people understand what it could be providing for them. So it could be providing hormesis for sure, vascular elasticity, absolute mood enhancement, regulation of hormones for sure, better excretion of toxins because we're having that, that squeezing and that pumping action. Insulin behavior is different, therefore sleep would be different. Cortisol changes. There's a lot of people that feel so much happier and less stressed because we are changing how the chemicals work in the brain, absolutely, and the body. You could consider cold water to be a shock for sure. It's very, from a sensory perspective, it's a very abrupt change, and the body will shoot a message right up to the brain, sending a message saying that this is dangerous, because we don't really perceive these temperatures in ways that are we're still dealing with certain parts of the brain that are just trying to keep us safe. So the body perceives cold water as not necessarily being a safe, relaxing thing, and it doesn't want to have you in there for too long. And when we do the breathing, it helps us manage it, because there's another part of our brain that says we actually want to be in here for a short amount of time because this is exercise. So there's 4 terms that I would want to tell anyone now to understand how to do a very elegant, beautiful cold exposure. Firstly, when our eyes look at cold water, like let's just use you, Dr. Stephanie, when you're in front of your culture tub and you're about to get in, your eyes see the water. So now your brain knows that water is there and you're about to get in it because you can see it. That's great. It's a beautiful opportunity to then start your easy, calm, diaphragmatic breathing. I ask people to start doing their calm breathing exercises before they get into the water, because we're already technically started that cold plunge process before we actually get in. I get to do this. This is amazing. I'm not going to be here for long. Let's see what the water feels like. I love my body. I love life. Life is good. So now we're doing the breathing. We see the water. We start descending into the water again using these positive belief systems and positive phrasing. Cold shock happens as soon as we get into the water because it's a very different shift, a very different change. And now we have the skin receptors sending messages that there's a little mini emergency happening. And the breath pattern that helps teach the body that we're calm will keep us and move us into that calm pattern faster. The breath pattern that we have sends messages to the blood, whether things are good or whether they're not. So even if we're not in danger, when we're not breathing in a way that's coded for calm, we can get stressed very easily. And you've seen that too when people hyperventilate or when they perceive something that's being an emergency, even if nothing's wrong, then they can spin out and really start to get anxious. So a calm nose inhale and a very long mouth exhale using the diaphragm, that's very important because a lot of people don't know where that is or aren't using that primarily, will get you to that calm place faster. And that tells your body nothing to see here. Your job is to manage this. So here's what I want to mention that I think will be very interesting for you. We can absolutely time our sessions, but here's what I like to tell people. You know that when you get into that calm place like that really just beautiful, spacious spot after that cold shock has passed, you're into a semi-relaxed state. Like there's a point when you're in that water where you ask yourself, wow, it feels like I could be in here forever. I feel really good.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's your body actually falling into that relaxed, adaptive space. To me, I tell people your body has now achieved the purpose of getting into cold, no matter what the time is. Usually it happens within 2 minutes anyway. So I say, you've got a short amount of time where you can hang out in that place. But once you've achieved that calm space where you've actually been able to, check this out, relax your body in an emergency, because cold, that's what cold is, then you've actually mastered that dip. You can get out if you want. And then the more important part is then warming up again to come back to a new normal. So people think that the cold water is often the thing, the most important thing. I try to help invite people to understand now that when they get out, the real work starts to happen because we've taken the body off balance by going in the water. But what we want to do is help people understand that the body now has a lot of work to bring itself back to a new normal. So there's 4 phases. There's the before phase where we see the water and we're having that positive conversation. There's the cold shock phase, which is super normal, and we have to breathe through that to get to that 3rd step, which is the relaxation phase, which usually happens between a minute and a half and maybe 3 minutes for some people. And then we exit and we start to rewarm again. Rewarming to me is an art and a science. There's a lot of finessing to it. People can do it in a sloppy way or they can do it in a very structured way that helps them get back to normal a little bit more quickly and efficiently. But you know what? Anything that people do with those 4 phases, as long as they're feeling good and not creating a guilt scenario or like a have-to mindset, I think is going to point us towards long-term health.
Fantastic. Okay, so I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, because that was a lot.
Just said. Yeah, that was excellent. Okay, so the shock response, so that 2nd phase. So the 1st phase, we're looking at the water, we're starting our breathing, diaphragmatic breathing. By the way, ladies, this is where you have to relax your belly. Stop holding your belly in. Let the belly expand. Don't breathe with your costal, like with your, don't breathe with your shoulders. that shock response, so that second part, I find that I often experience that. Like, I don't know if that's ever gone away for me, and that might just be I need to manipulate the temperature a little bit. So my question here is, does the shock response happen all the time? Will it attenuate over time? Does it get better if, let's say, that the stimulus is the same, like the temperature is the same, and you replicate the same environmental conditions, let's say? And then I remember when I was getting my children to try the cold plunge for the first time, I made it warmer for them, but I also primed them and I said, your brain is going to want you to get out like literally the second that you feel this water. So just know that that's going to happen and continue to breathe through it. But the breathing, like that, at least my shock response breathing is like I'm breathing almost very shallowly, but then I'm just literally coaching myself, like breathe a little deeper, exhale, like keep that exhale a little longer. Like I'm literally just talking myself through it. And then eventually I do get into that very quiet, it almost feels like you're at the bottom of the ocean and everything is still and there's no, you can just stay there forever. So my question is around the shock response. Does that happen every time? Is that something that you can expect? And maybe is that a good thing? Because now, to your point, you are able to stay calm when there is a perceived emergency.
This is so important, this question. And I think that anytime I talk to someone, I want people to understand that the shock response is normal and we don't need to judge it. I think anytime that I experience that response to some degree or another, it's my body letting me know that something has changed and it's looking to manage it. And that's what we want. That's why we get into water. So if people, lose their breath or they're fighting the cold, they want to, overcome it and they want to beat it, and that'll never happen. So I think the more that we relax through the whole process, just like you said, relaxing our shoulders, relaxing our jaw, using our bellies, breathing 360 degrees, all the systems, right? All the muscles, using the intercostals, using the back muscles, using all kinds of normal breathing muscles that will help move through that phase a little bit more. I don't want to say safe because it's not really about safety, but it just more efficiently. I'll use that word.
Or consistently.
Yeah, consistently. We don't need to try to judge the shock response. A lot of people think that it's wrong and it's bad and it's supposed to go away over time. When I hear people partying late till 2 a.m. on a Friday and then coming to a workshop on Saturday, that shock response is going to be bigger.
Much bigger.
People are tired, they're sad, they had an argument before they came to the workshop, that shock response, that cold will feel colder. So I think a lot of this has to do with mental training and that position that you take before you get into the water, or what happened that morning, or just, do you have a general positive attitude around life? I wouldn't worry too much about that. The body is going to respond the way it intelligently knows how to respond, and it's our job to allow those systems to move through us in a way that our very intelligent system knows how to move through. I think when our minds and our egos start to judge these things, that's when we diminish the experience and then make it bad or wrong or, not enough, or a lot of things that you hear, maybe, other people that you talk to, certainly people I talk to in workshops, they're trying to kill these human responses because they look vulnerable. Right. And I really want people to understand that that's normal.
I love that. Okay, that's good. And that actually gives me some that I've never heard that before. I have, sort of heard that you should be able to overcome it. It should go away with time. And I was like, well, mine actually never went away.
Who said that?
Oh, I mean, I've heard cold water experts say that. It's like, oh, with time, because your resilience to the cold increases, that shock response changes. And I've always felt like, oh, well, then I'm like, what's wrong with me? I have it literally every time I get in the water. So that certainly gives me some comfort selfishly, but I think that it's also permission for the listeners who are interested by cold water immersion or who practice it to say, oh, okay, like this is actually, we should expect this every time, and like not judge it when it shows up. In the same way that, you just said, if you've been out partying or you get in late last night and then you show up the next day to a workout, like you can't necessarily expect to do the same volume, the same intensity, the same weights in the gym. In the same way that's going to apply to cold water, like your resilience, like your capacity is not quite as full than it otherwise might be if you've had a full restful sleep. You've had, you're in more parasympathetic than not.
Cold water is a challenge, and so
Yeah.
We need to let it be a challenge. And I think that if people have responses, if people have been doing it for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and they don't have that response, great. If you still have that response after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, great. Like I'm very neutral on that phase. I'm very, very neutral. I want to help people embrace and accept all aspects of intelligent change so that they can just have more fun during this process and not make something wrong or bad that is actually a normal part of our nervous system response.
I love that. And you've actually, yes, even just in saying that, it's sort of put together some pieces in my own cold water experience. So thank you. Let's move through the other two. So we get over the shock response, and now we're in that phase 3 where we're, let's say, 1.5 to 3 minutes in, where there's peace, there's calm. I have always counseled people to stay in until there's a shiver response of some sort. It doesn't matter if you're shivering at 2 minutes or you're shivering at 8 minutes. The temperature, as we've said, the temperature of the water is going to change that, how much you've slept the night before, what state you're in, what your capacity, what your own reserve is. Is that aligned with what you typically recommend, or is there something else that you look for in terms of, I know that people are like, oh, but Huberman said it should be 11 minutes a week, or whoever, it doesn't matter. Like, no shade to Andrew. He does a great job. But, if there's typically that sort of recommendation, I think that came from him. It might not have, but at least I heard it. I've heard him say that. What is the length of time? Are we just waiting to elicit a shiver response? How long do we decide to stay in there? As long as we want, we're like, all right, I've had enough. This is good. I'm out.
I have some very controversial things to say. And some of it is basically from just where I am in the phase of my understanding and my expertise too. So for some people, it may not be right for them. Nobody has to agree with my position. In fact, 5 years from now, I might change my position. But today I'm going to tell you some things that might be useful. I have tried to take that shivering protocol and actually study it to see what it's all about. And there was a few conversations that happened after that from the same people that started talking about it that dismissed it because they found that it wasn't as useful or trackable as they thought it was going to be when it first started. So here's what I'm going to say about it with the knowledge that I have. When we talk about the 4 parts that we talked about, when we look at it, we get in the water and then, we get to that calm and then we get out. There's a part of the system, to the best of my knowledge, that when you start to have a shiver response after that phase of feeling good and in that really beautiful, gap of feeling calm, when the body starts to shiver again, which for most people, roughly around 4 minutes, you're out of that calm phase. Many people would consider that to be then a loss of control because the muscles are now trying to create heat in the body that it's lost in a way that would be a little bit more pressing. The muscles, when it's shivering, is technically trying to, the word is violently, but it's just, what's another word for like not excited? It's excitedly trying to contract muscles to try and create more heat in the system. What people don't
spirited attempt to
yes,
create
thank
heat.
you, thank you.
Yes,
thank you so much. When we exit the water, we're still cooling in the system.
Right.
And most people don't know that. So that's a beautiful window to start to get afterdrop. And afterdrop is prehypothermia. And prehypothermia, one of the signs is shivering, like I just described, spirited shivering.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure where the shivering intelligently starts and the prehypothermia starts. Where would that be? So because I'm teaching 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people at a time, I don't want people shivering and now feeling uncomfortable while other people are doing other things. I want the group to kind of move together in a way that they feel like they're in control. So when I look at muscle fiber shivering, to me, that's the muscle has lost control of the heating process. I want to generally stay away from that. I also tried to find anyone that would actually video that process of shivering, couldn't find it. It's too uncomfortable. In fact, some of those protocols was like shivering stop shivering, go back in again, come out, like shiver. Like it sounded miserable.
Torture.
It
It's
sounded
torture.
miserable.
Yeah.
So when I looked at it as a bigger picture, and because I'm all about fun, I just thought, forget this. This is not worth the one thing or the two things that they think that's going to get you. And remember when I talked about not feeling good, like mentally? If we're feeling uncomfortable to the point where we're feeling bad, is that really helping our immune system too long term? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and that comes back to that idea that everything has to hurt and everything has to be a struggle and it has to be suffering in order for it to be effective or worth your time. So I think that point is well taken. So just for my own clarity then, because I'm the person that stays until she's shivering.
Yeah, I wouldn't
And
bother.
again, that's the type A in me that I am actively working on getting to know and love. If we were to sort of give it a time limit, is it in that 1.5 to 3 minute range that we should be in, like before you would say before that shivering starts, and then we get out, and then I have a follow up question on the warm up phase. But is that sort of your general recommendation? Is like 1.5 after the shock, you settled in, everything feels good, you surrender to the cold, you find your courage, and then 3 minutes go by, and you're like, all right, I'm not shivering, but this was great. Good times, time to get out.
Yes, because I tell, and a lot of instructors say, like, just get out when you feel good, because your body's already achieved that adaptation phase.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we're trying to do is create strength. And if we've already adapted that extreme temperature and come to that management phase, then what else is there to do except to get out and recalibrate then and rewarm?
That's great. So get out when you feel good.
Get out when you feel good.
That's good. Okay.
And so that might be 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And this doesn't really come into the conversation of, when people get in and they're having such a stress response that they're shivering because they're afraid or their body is having that response. That's a little bit different. Like, when you see people, shiver because it's the first time and they're just really nervous. That's different. We want to breathe through that because we can help manage that too. But I think once we get to that groove, your body is telling you that it's figured it out. Well, isn't that why we got in the first place?
Yeah, there is a stillness. So to your point, I've noticed this in the gym a lot when I'm pushing myself really hard. It's usually on a leg day. My nervous system, if I sort of I don't want to say cross a line because it implies that it's wrong, but I will start to shake.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very similar to like an animal,
Mm-hmm.
a zebra that's just been chased by a lion, makes it out alive. They kind of shake and then they're on with their day. That's sort of what happens, I think, with humans, because we don't just shake it off and get over it. We don't shake. We sort of bury it. And there's this residue on the nervous system. And so when you are in a situation, for me, it tends to be leg day because I'm really digging deep. It's like you can kind of unlock some of that residue. You can sort of unlock some of that pain, angst, fear, rage, whatever. And then it sort of comes out in the form of shaking. So it actually happened to me this morning. I was doing legs this morning and I just had to sit on the bench because my left leg I was doing Bulgarian split squats, which, they just test everyone. But, they're particularly for me, just like a bit of a mind game. I had to sit down because my leg was just shaking. I was like, all right, girl, let's just shake it out in the gym. That's what we come here for,
Mm-hmm.
So that's great. Okay. So I have a question about the rewarming. So now we get out when we feel good. So that 1.5 to 3, maybe before 4 minute mark. What you mentioned, you sort of said it in passing, and I wanted to maybe double click on this. It can be done very sloppily, I think was your terminology, or there's maybe a right way or some best practices that we can think about in that rewarming to avoid the after drop. So what are some of the ways that you like in that fourth phase when we've been in there, we get out when we feel good, and now it's time to rewarm? I've heard everything from don't use a towel, let your body naturally come back up to room temperature on your own, to towel off or jump in a sauna or something like that. So what are some of the things that you like to counsel people on in that rewarm phase?
This phase is the Wild West right now. And I think that there's a lot of individuality that I think people can practice. I want to be very, very free and relaxed about this phase, even though I want to say a couple of things that are very specific. How everyone rewarms, in fact, how everyone does everything is individual. So I've given people an overview of the phases, but when we get out, the fact that we put our attention on something else instead of giving our body the respect to focus to rewarm is where we can misstep. So I think how well we get back to our new normal so that we can go to our next task is going to take a shorter amount of time or a longer amount of time, depending on how we focus our mind on our body processes in that moment. So because we know that cold water is a vasoconstrictor when we get out, when you start to see that, that little lobster tan or that ice tan that people see, that red line, you don't see that in cold water. It only happens second you emerge and those capillaries just open right up again. That's really cool. To me, I find that really interesting. Right. So because that's happening, the veins will slowly start to open, and that's when the cold blood and the warm blood start mixing together. We want to do that phase very carefully and gently. If we run right into the sauna, the veins just go blah, and they open up really fast. And if there's cold blood going to the heart, well, that's not really the favorite pastime of the heart, is to receive cold blood. Cold blood doesn't really, and the heart don't really play well together. So we want to mix that a little bit more carefully with time. I think your whole system will cycle all your blood maybe once every, 1 minute. So we want to give it some time to start to mix gently. So when we go into the sauna, that's when you can even introduce after drop there, because the core temperature will go down a little bit, and then the body will say, oh, I'm not, that's not good. So then you'll start shivering maybe in the sauna. But what I like to tell people is to start doing some isometric contractions, not like a closed chain, slow movement, like not jumping jacks and not push-ups, but just get into a squat, squeeze your big muscles, squeeze your quads, squeeze your glutes. That could be an isometric contraction or just slow movement. Lats for sure. Those are huge, huge muscles, which will slowly start to reheat your body a little bit more safely and intelligently from the inside out. Now, check this out. When you focus on doing that, when you have a conversation with your system, like, we're going to reheat now, you're going to do that really efficiently, as opposed to, and this is fine too, but it just takes longer. I'm going to take a selfie, or I'm going to focus on, someone else, or I'm going to go just walk and put on my clothes and not think about anything. I really want people to start to get some interoception, to really start to feel what's going on, because it's a magical, beautiful moment where you can create and generate so much internal power and awareness. And these skills you'll be able to use outside of these practices too, because when you have awareness of yourself in the world, you have a little bit more, I would say, autonomy.
Beautiful. That's great. I never thought of doing isometrics. That makes so much sense. Like a closed chain, like a lunge position, and you're just maybe holding the lunge.
Slow squat, or just do a sumo squat and just hang out there. I promise you're going to get hot really quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the sort of the advice that maybe we've heard online around, like, naturally allowing yourself to warm up to like not allowing, like, don't use a towel, don't use any heat. You're not necessarily a fan of that.
No. And I'm not saying that doesn't work for some people. I have very specific preferences when I want to help someone learn how to build a practice. And the idea is, how much power can you develop inside your body and your mind so that you can just pull it out and use it anywhere? And so if you want to do that, like, if you want to, well, not when it's like sub-zero weather, you don't want to dry off naturally. You're just going to have the water freeze to your skin, and that's not great either.
Right.
But I will say something. The very first time that I did an ice bath at a workshop, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to be an instructor. And of course, you want to do these things before you take all that time and you invest all that energy. I was petrified for 5 days. I was thinking about it for 5 days. I was frightened. And, we breathe so much and we focus so much. By the time I got in there, no joke, I didn't feel the cold water at all. It was -6 Celsius outside. And I had zero. It was wild. I felt so peaceful. And we weren't really allowed to go right inside again. We were, being taught again to use this rewarming technique. I was outside in flip-flops and a bathing suit for 20 minutes in -6. No problem. And so this really does come down to, you have a massive opportunity to use your mind to generate some position about how you see yourself in the world. I know that a lot of people won't spend time doing that because they're on to doing other things. They have a very limited amount of time. But I'm telling you, if you take every third time to do this, you will start to see yourself in the world in a different way, and you will start to have more command and more control over your internal processes that you never thought possible before. So I wanted to, gently apologize about the shivering thing, because I know a lot of people use that and they think it's really important. I just don't think that's where we want to go in the bigger picture of cold exposure, especially when it comes to fun and feeling good and challenging ourselves. And that hormesis part, I think the shivering can be just put on the side for now. It's very stressful for the system.
And that's why we have guests like you on the show to help school people who are maybe have misunderstood it. And you've put in obviously a lot of reps in terms of facilitating some of these cold water immersions. And yeah, that's what these conversations are for. So I appreciate, and it's sure it's controversial in terms of like it's not necessarily what I've heard, but I really value your opinion. So I'm glad that you felt comfortable enough and honest enough to really say what you think. So thank you.
Yeah, and if you wanted to go there, then do it. But I just don't think it's giving everyone what they think it's giving them right
Yeah.
now.
So what is the frequency that you think that we should be employing this? So if we're in there, let's say the total time, maybe we're cold plunging, including the time before and maybe the warm up, or no, the time that you're in is somewhere around 3 minutes, 4 minutes tops. How often on a weekly basis should this be employed? If you're a woman who is still cycling, she still has her menstrual cycle, have you noticed different capacity for tolerance over the course of the cycle? Maybe she's more, and you might not have asked this. This is just where I like to play. And like, how does the menstrual cycle affect things? How does perimenopause affect things? So it's okay if you haven't necessarily observed that. But how often, let's say just general population, how often should we be doing it? And then maybe we can carve out if you've noticed anything in terms of female specific benefits or frequencies.
This is a brilliant question. And I think that anytime that someone asks me this, I always go back to exercise. How many times a week do you like to exercise, or how much time do you have in your week to practice this? And most people, for general fitness purposes, it's 3 to 5 times a week. And I'm going to give people, maybe you haven't heard about this, but this could be a great time to introduce this, is extremity training. So I'm doing a lot of research now to find out what coaches are also starting to explore and study extremity training, and can it actually have a full systemic effect on the body? We're not sure yet, but I will tell you something. In 2019, when I had my first workshop, I did have an assistant, a friend who wanted to volunteer. She was on anti-anxiety medication. I think she was recovering from an eating disorder, very, very stressed life. Very diminutive woman, didn't know anything about cold, never took a cold shower before. She was going to do a full body dunk with me in the ice bath with everybody. But at the last minute, she got really nervous and she opted out. She decided to put just her arms in, probably just past her elbows in this ice bath. Maybe 45 seconds to a minute long. Good enough for her. I thought that was amazing because she touched the cold water. That's all I want people to do, is just to touch it so they can get over that, that fear perception. She calls me 4 days later and she said, "Marie, you wouldn't believe what happened." I said, "Tell me what happened." She said, after that, time I put my hands in the water, I felt good enough to go get a haircut and run some errands. My mood was so great. And I just thought, that's really weird. There was not enough science back then for me to actually research that or look at that. And now I'm starting to see that people are starting to out these short partial immersions, legs, arms, face, and it's helping their mood. So I started to also introduce hand, face, and foot immersion outside of, not in addition to a full bath, but outside of those full body workshops, so that people could understand that they can train those parts separately. As you know, your feet and your toes and your fingers can get very
It's the hardest part.
sensitive. So
Yeah.
when you take your hands and get a little container and put your hands in ice water for about a minute and then take them out. And then, like we talked about, focus on having that conversation of rewarming. You will start to see over a few weeks. If you did it once a week, you'll start to see that when you're then in the water full body, you won't have those finger and toe responses if you can help the body understand that it can open and close a little bit more efficiently. So there was one study that they did on cold water fishermen, and they're still looking to see if there's a full systemic effect because they had their hands in cold water. So I thought, I wonder how many people that will never take an ice bath I could teach this to. And I've had incredible success with people feeling so much more empowered because they can do hand or leg or foot training or splash their face with cold water, and they'll still start to feel positive effects where they maybe don't have the physical environment or the time to do these kinds of things. So on the days where you're not doing full body, stand in some snow in a safe place, or get your feet in some really cold water for a minute and then watch them warm up and feel them warm up. There's just so many stories that I've heard from people that I've done workshops for. There's not enough time in this episode to talk about it because so many people have talked about how surprised they were when they did that and how useful they found it to be. So that's something that I really like to help people open their mind to, is if you're not going to do a cold shower, maybe just have the water run on your legs. If you're not going to do a full body ice bath because either physiologically or mentally that's not for you, or you can't do it, or you just don't have the environment or the means to, then put your hands in water, run your arms under cold water, splash your face with cold water, even think about cold water. And that's going to start changing your physiology to help receive these frequencies and these systems in a way that's positive and helpful.
The other thing I think that a hand or a foot or a face immersion might give you is also, it seems less intimidating.
Hard.
It's hard, but it seems like a good point of entry, with using the example of the woman who didn't necessarily want to do full body immersion. It's like, all right, I'll put my hands in. It's like, all right, that's sort of like almost like an intermediary. One of the things I have found is the hardest part of the cold plunge is the burning. It's like my feet are burning, my hands are burning. I even get sort of like my neck. I have a hard time with my neck, my elbows, my shoulders. And again, smaller area. So, you're more, maybe exposed to the cold. But I really like the idea of like, okay, I don't have the capacity today to do a full body plunge. I'll just go up to my elbows and I can do that. And it feels fun. And it feels like 1.5 to 2 minutes and I can breathe and I can still, it's sort of like an intermediary step between the full body immersion. And it seems like there can be still some benefits that are reaped from it, in the same way that there's been quite a bit of research around cooling your hands in between sets of, let's say, back workouts, right? So if you're doing pull-ups, like if you have, they're like copper, the company's called Apex Cool Labs. They sent me, a shout out to Apex, but they sent me these copper cold things that I just put my hands on in between, let's say, my lats. I'm doing pull-ups or I'm doing a lat pull or whatever. And I can rep out a lot more. Like I feel like I recover a lot more. So there is something to that where we are cooling down extremities, and then and it's probably, and maybe you can speak to this in terms of your experience, it's probably easier over time for your hands and your feet to be cold, because I've seen people wear like socks and like special socks and special mittens and stuff to get in the cold water, but maybe we can train, maybe we don't need that.
There's always going to be some people that have neuropathy and have a mental barrier to having their hands exposed. I will say one thing, that the dozens of people that I've run this through, it's harder than a full body ice bath, to be honest, for many people.
Oh, it is?
Yeah,
okay.
It's really hard.
Okay.
Although it's more accessible.
Mentally, it feels mentally to me, like when you say, oh, go up to my elbows, I'm like, I could totally do that every day. Like I feel like that's more accessible mentally to me, but that just might be, that's not necessarily for everybody.
I think that's why I've started to introduce this practice, because it's mentally more accessible for people. But when they finally do it, they realize this is a really tough exercise. Okay. So you're still going to get that burning depending on how much ice is in the water, how cold the water is. Here's what I'm going to say to everybody too. Practice all temperatures. Practice in the ways that is the most fun for you. Practice hand training, practice foot training. Because some people say that their hands are really brutal. Some people say their toes, it's out of control and they can't do it for very long. Change the temperature. Just allow the body to understand that it's being asked to do something that's a little bit outside of what it considers to be normal, so that it can just get a little bit stronger. I really want to help people understand that this still can be gentle, but I will say that when someone takes a cold shower at 10 Celsius and says that's really hard, as soon as you get it down to 6, it's still going to feel hard.
Right.
It's still going to feel challenging. Doesn't matter whether it's 10, 14. I mean, I'll still have that response at all temperatures. And so just have fun, and your body will surprise you as long as you continue to understand that you can control these systems through breathing and help yourself manage these moments pretty much any time, actually. When you're breathing properly, you can handle almost any situation. That's a non-emergency situation. But I think that when we start to understand that we can manage all these temperatures, then we get to pick and choose how we want to play with the cold.
One of the things I've noticed about the culture tub, or my use of the culture tub with cold water immersion, is that it really helps with recovery. There has been some discussion around the timing of cold plunges relative to the time of your exercise, either immediately before, not immediately after. I typically do the next day. So today was legs, tomorrow's cold water immersion. Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of what your recommendations might be? Do you like to if you are thinking about your own routine or how you counsel your clients, do you like to say first thing in the morning before anything? Do we put a buffer of time in between, let's say a stimulus like exercise and the hormetic adaptations that happen there, and a cold water immersion? What are your thoughts there?
Beautiful. So I think that when we look at your life specifically, or when the listener is looking at their life specifically, there's a pattern and a preference. I never want to take someone out of their normal pattern. So if I ask you to get up at 4 and do cold water and you don't normally get up at 4, that's not going to work. When we look at what physiologically is optimal for the system, and then we look at real life, we'll start to see a lot of choices we can't make because it just doesn't fit all the other things that we have to do. So if doing cold exposure pre-heavy weight workout works for you, amazing. But some people don't like that. It takes a little bit longer to warm up after because the muscles are colder.
Yeah.
Or they don't like the way that feels early in the morning, or they want to meditate and have breakfast before. Do what you think. Try it out. Test it out. See how you feel after a week or 2 or maybe 30 days, and then course correct after that. And I think there's a lot of value to taking this data and implementing it, but there's even more value honoring your own inherent patterns and playing with what people think is great so that you can find a life that works really great for you, because the science is going to change anyway. 5 years from now, we'll be talking about something totally different. So I think we want to grip science a little bit less tightly because it changes all the time. So I'd rather see people enjoy what they're doing and incorporating aspects of these things as opposed to trying to contort their life around the data.
Right.
So I like all temperatures, short amounts of time, get to that relaxed place, practice warming up consciously, and then, have fun and enjoy your life. Pre is great. Post heavyweight workout would be maybe like 3 hours, I suppose. Even though if you're not doing major Olympic lifting or you're not getting paid to do these things, there's still controversy about that. Like, do you really want to wait 3 hours because you're going to diminish like a 0.5% gain? I don't know. It's different for everybody. So if you want to feel like you're doing it by the book, then create that time for yourself, because if that helps you feel better, then do that. But even if you want to just rinse your legs off in cold after a heavyweight workout to cool just the muscles, that might feel good for you too. I saw one study with runners that they were doing, I think it was 10 Celsius cooling for a couple of minutes just to get the heat down. And so that's something to practice. Or last week, just one new study I read, 3 minutes once a week increases glutathione levels. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Wow, I wonder if I can find more than one study about that. This stuff really, fires me up. I think it's really useful that these people are looking at these things, partial immersion, or, how can we get the most out of the least amount of time in the cold, and just to play around with it, because your body's changing too. So if we look at the data and your body's not in that place, then we're not really sure unless we draw your blood exactly what's going on. So I like to just make it like a big salad. Be consistent, be positive, be curious, challenge yourself, enjoy the fact that you have these luxuries to stress yourself out in these ways, and that your nervous system will start to adapt and change, so that when you're in like I thought I lost my wallet, and then I didn't. I'm like, oh, I guess I'll just make a few phone calls.
Right.
Well,
Yeah. I think
I should be mad, and I wasn't mad. And I just thought, how come I'm not having that response? And I thought, oh, I know why.
Yeah.
I know why.
Because you learn how to deal with crisis.
And it just happened by itself.
And I think that there is a tendency, and I'll say myself included, to perseverate on the mechanistic data. It's like, oh, you need to wait 3 to 4 hours so that the adaptations from exercise are not obliterated or abated by doing a cold water immersion because now you're causing the vasoconstriction, da 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 da. And I'm like, okay, so I guess I have to do that now. Or what I typically do is I'll do the next, like, so legs today, tomorrow's going to be upper body. So I will do a cold water immersion before because I know my legs will be sore at some point. Usually when I wake up, I can sort of feel like what I've done the day before. So I typically will do it in the morning, day after legs, which is like, in my mind, checks off that, all right, I've waited at least 4 hours and now like the adaptations to exercise are not going to be impacted. But what I like, I like what I'm hearing here, which is just figure out what, like, is there optimal times to work out? You could make that argument. Yes, it would be 12 o'clock because core body temperature and joints have been lubricated. You've probably had a meal, but like 12 o'clock doesn't work for everybody. Doesn't work for me. I work out in the morning when my joints are sometimes really stiff and I'm really tired and I don't feel like it, but that's the time that I have. So I sort of make that work. And I think the permission that you're talking about is like, just kind of play, like just sort of play with it and see where you land. And it changes over time anyway. You might find like the absolute perfect cadence and ritual for yourself. And then life gets lifing. And then you have to sort of adapt and change anew anyway.
So true, because, your heart and your colon and your muscles don't know what like 10 is or 1 minute. Like there's only really kind of one part in your body that I can actually numerically count. And I think when we start to also tap into the power of our senses and our sensory feeling and that intuition and that interoception, then we're accessing more power and more information on top of numbers. Anyone can force their way through a 2-minute ice bath. Anybody. I can teach anyone just to power through it. But there's a beauty and an art and an inherent magical power to be able to put your hand in cold water and actually tell the temperature. That's what I like to play and practice. Like, can you have someone set your tub to a certain temperature and you get in and then start to guess the temperature? So these things are fun for me. This is how I look at this practice. I just want it to be more light. I want it to be more interesting and I want it to be less mechanistic so that we can start to incorporate all the beautiful systems that we have, because I think a lot of these things get discounted within our bodies. Like we don't thank our heart enough for putting us through a really beautiful workout, or, when we don't really acknowledge how intelligent our blood is. And I want clean blood as just much as the next person, but we focus on, what are we eating as opposed to like how our body is metabolizing and using this energy and this frequency. So there's a lot of opportunity to play within these realms. Counting is important. It is very important, but it's not, I don't think it's the most important thing.
Can we replicate? So obviously you and I have cold tubs. We have cold plunges. I started off with showers and then I moved to my bathtub. I would go to the gas station and I would get ice. It became very difficult for me to sort of manipulate the temperature. It became like pretty annoying actually, because I never knew how cold or how warm it was actually going to be. And that was sort of the impetus for me to invest in a cold plunge. One of the things that I found difficult about the shower is that the water is always moving. Mm-hmm. So like in the cold plunge, it's the water's still. Like you sort of create this little thermal layer. You're in there, you sort of create this like mini thermal layer while you're there. Can we replicate my question here is, can we replicate the benefits in a shower or in a bathtub? If you're like, okay, right now this is not available to me, but I can't, I don't have space or I don't have whatever it is for a plunge. Can we replicate some of the benefits with a cold shower? And how is that different? Like with the water movement, is there any difference there? Would you recommend a cold, like in your bathtub if you have one? What would be, are these comparable in any way?
You asked the best questions. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. So if someone has a shower, someone actually gave me a little silicone basket where I could attach it to the sides of the walls of my shower stall and then put ice inside and then stand under that. And so not only, and your mind is going right now, not only are you having cold now ice water, it's ice water that's moving. So that's usually for me. I don't do it too often, but when I do it, I actually start laughing, because the harder it gets for me, the more I have that laugh response, because it's so difficult. We're doing studies with standardized ice baths. Technically, ice baths would be 5 Celsius to, I guess you would call it 1 Celsius. That's what a standardized ice bath is. And that's what most of the studies are revolving around. But you also have, sensors in your system that recognize windows of 6 to 10 degrees, or 11 to 15 degrees, or maybe 50. Like, we all have sensors for different temperatures. So that's why I like working all those temperatures. But if you're in a shower, take a shower, or hopefully we will have some data down the road that will help that, but we just can't standardize the shower just because it's just so different. If you're feeling challenged, amazing. If you learn how to breathe and warm up after, amazing. Use what you can. And if you're in a bath and you want to start making, I found some silicone containers now that can actually freeze blocks. So I like to freeze like big, big blocks and put them in my tub, and then get this little thermometer to get there like around 6. And then I get LED lights and I put them in my water, and I make this huge, like, turn all the lights off and make it into a club. I do some crazy things because I
party in your tub.
Totally party in my
party
tub.
in your tub.
Party for one. So that to me is fun because I just want to make it more interesting. But I've had some holy moments getting quiet and having that, that beautiful, quiet immersion. And then there's other times where I want to blast the music and just like rock through. So I think whatever you like to do, make it your own. Practice listening to your system, practice using the timer, practice heating up, practice, getting into a sauna after a few minutes. We want that cushion, right? 5 or 10 minutes after we get out of the cold. If you want to introduce sauna, that's great. And then there's other contrast protocols that I love that Dr. Rhonda Patrick has talked about. So I think that, I hope I answered your question. I think that when someone has a tub, you can even just fill it up with cold water. It's still going to be challenging. Sit in there. Make sure that you have a maximum time too. You don't want to be feeling good and saying, oh, I could be in here forever, and then push yourself, because that's how I got after drop 3 times in the beginning, because I just wasn't sure when to stop. I think, the shorter the better, especially in the beginning. And then gentle increments. If you want to do it twice a day, just know that you can overtrain. So I'm hearing people online doing, 1 year, no breaks, 100 days, no breaks. And
I've seen that too.
Okay, so here's what I'll say about that. And listen, I'm not the authority on 100-day immersions, and I'm certainly not the authority on a lot of the things that we talked about, because I don't look at the blood. I read the same studies that everyone else puts out, and I have my interpretations on them based on how good I want to feel, or how empowered do I want my cells to be. And that's a newer conversation for a lot of people. But when I see people talking about doing 6 months or 9 months with no breaks, and then I see someone getting into a lake that's 10 degrees and they immediately start shivering, to me, that's overtraining. Signs of overtraining is you're shivering quickly. You're feeling the cold and it doesn't feel good. You're pushing yourself and you're not feeling, you're trying to strong arm your practice. You're irritable. You're not sleeping well. Your digestion is off. You're not recovering in the gym. Same signs of overtraining in the gym. You can overtrain in cold water. And what I also realized last year recently is when you're spending too much time in the water, you will start to develop oxidative stress, and the cold water will start to age you. No one's really talking about that. You can do too much of everything. You can do too much sauna. You can do too much cold. You can do too much sleep, too much food, too much training, too much breathing. You can do too much of everything, too much hydration. And cold water is not inert. It's a huge force, and it's prudent to approach it with a minimum time goal so that you can get the maximum out of your life in other areas.
This is so wise. I mean, it's so obvious when we're talking that you have done this many, many times, that you've spoken to many people. And this is sort of what I've noticed, even in myself, although I still actively, and transparently sort of unwind some of my mechanistic proclivities and tendencies, is that the more that you speak to people, the more that you see sort of a common experience, or you see the same mistakes being made, I think that you tend to relax a little bit. I used to think about fasting, and you could only do fasting a certain way. And I'm like, you know what? We all fast every day. You don't need to fast for 24 hours. You don't need to do that, girl. You don't need to hurt yourself that way. And it's the same with the gym. It's the same with food. It's like, there's no bad food. It's just overconsumption of food. Like, fruits are your friend. Carbs are your friend. It's like, it's just the overconsumption. To your point, it's like the over exercising, the over sleeping, the over consuming of anything, water, sauna, all the things, you sort of ride the bell curve of maximum benefit. You sort of reach that apex, and then there's like a diminishing return. The more you do it, it's not more is more. sometimes more is less. It's more is worse. And then you sort of reach that extreme, like you're saying, where you start shivering immediately and your digestion and your sleep and your recovery start, all these factors start to disintegrate. And it would be very similar with training. It's like the physical fatigue that you accumulate, let's say with cold water immersion or with training. Sometimes you accumulate it faster than you can dissipate it. And it's just really it's an art. I mean, there's a science, but I would also say there's an art to knowing yourself, that interoception that you've been talking about, to be able to auto-regulate and to check in with yourself and say, how do I feel today? What's my capacity? What's my reserve? What can I leverage and what do I need to not leverage today? Like I often say on the show, like I love the word leverage. I love leverage. But sometimes we don't have to leverage. Sometimes we don't have to maximize. We don't have to optimize. Sometimes we just gotta chill. We just gotta step back. We gotta breathe, as you're saying,
Like at what point after we grew up did we have all these rules and then we took all the fun away? At what point did we start to really change how we began to judge ourselves? And to me, a big part of my role is when I see a group of 40 people, they're not optimally relaxed.
Yeah.
They're there because they wanted to get away from their family. Some people are dealing with addictions. Some people are in recovery. Some people are on, medication. They're not doing well. Most people aren't doing well these days.
Mm-hmm.
So when we introduce this huge stressor, then people are like, I can't look foolish. I'm in a bathing suit. Everything's hanging out. My life is terrible now. Like judge. And so part of my job and what I love about what I do is to help people to just blow that out. When we get into that breath practice and we change how the brain works and we shut that part off, they connect to their heart, they connect to all, they connect to each other, and then something really magical happens. They open up to the possibility of, what if I didn't have these rules for my life just for the next 2 hours? Like, what could I learn about myself? What could I demonstrate to somebody else? So something I've seen that's been very surprising very recently in the past maybe 6 or 7 months, that's happened more now than ever before, is that yes, people are stressed, but when they go in and sometimes they get out because they say, this is too much, I can't handle it. They see other people just staying there calmly, just breathing, just like, we've talked about it when they're in there and then they just get out, they go in calmly and they get out calmly and they look at that person and they go away and then they come back to me and they say, can I try it again? Can I go in again?
Yeah.
Huge magic.
Like, yes, you get a redo. Of course you do.
Lottery. Because they left, but then they came back on their own terms. And then every single time, I've seen this every single time, they go in and they stay longer. So now they've just opened up a new possibility for themselves that me talking will never open up. So we have to give people these opportunities to drop the picture of who they think they are so that they can get connected to this beautiful element, water, and create a relationship with water and themselves. And yes, there's numbers and timing, and we talked about that too, but there's going to be a point where you're not counting. You're just there. You're just in the present moment. You're fill in the blank thing that you didn't want to have happen. That's not an issue anymore. And you're just a person and your heart is beating and you're feeling alive and you're loving your life in that moment and you're feeling powerful and then you're feeling good. And we need more of those wins right now because we can start to stack those in ways that, I'll never know when I leave people. And that's why weekend workshops are powerful too, because people come back and then they tell people about what they thought about and they get to witness other people and it's magic, magic, magic. So do all the things, count, don't count, change the temperature, practice the times, have fun, connect to your heart, thank yourself for being powerful. You get to do this. You don't have to do this, and enjoy the cold, enjoy the heat, enjoy the food, enjoy life, and enjoy each other, because for me, that's what this is all about.
Well, I don't think I think this is a perfect time to end this conversation on that note. Can I get an amen? Can I get all the things? That was absolutely beautifully said. Marie, where can people find more about you and your work?
So you can also, if people want to email me and they have a question, marie@culture.com is the culture contact. And of course, if people want to get more calm, they can also visit innerpeaceportal.com. There's some free resources there that people can find. I have breath practice every month online, meditation. I use principles of positive intelligence too to help reframe thinking and help empower people with their thought processes so they can start to build the life that they want and feel less unnecessary fear.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Very happy to be here. And thank you so much for today.